The dust cloud on the horizon grew steadily larger as Xavier Cole urged his exhausted horse onward, the relentless Montana sun beating down on his weather-worn hat. 6 months on the trail had left him with little more than the clothes on his back, the Winchester rifle in his saddle holster, and a desperate need for something he couldn't quite name. It was 1878, and the promise of new beginnings in the Western Territories had drawn men like Xavier from every corner of the country. At 32, he'd seen enough bloodshed during his years as an Army scout to last several lifetimes. The Sioux Wars had ended the previous year, but the memories remained, haunting his dreams and driving him ever westward, away from the ghosts of his past. The small homestead appeared like a mirage, a modest cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a barn that needed fresh paint, and a sprawling oak tree providing shade to a clothesline where a woman hung laundry. Xavier slowed his horse to a walk, taking in the scene with weary eyes that had seen too much hardship to trust beauty at first glance. The woman hadn't noticed him yet. Her movements were graceful as she reached into a wicker basket, shaking out a white sheet before pinning it to the line. Her dark hair was pulled back, a few wayward strands dancing in the breeze around her face. She wore a simple blue dress, practical for the work of a homesteader's wife. As Xavier approached, a young boy of about 7 darted from behind the cabin, followed by a smaller girl who couldn't have been more than 5. They chased each other around their mother, their laughter carrying across the open space like music. Something tightened in Xavier's chest, a longing so intense it nearly stole his breath. In that moment, watching the woman and her children, he saw everything he'd been searching for without knowing he was looking. A family, a home, a place where nightmares might finally surrender to peace. The boy spotted him first, stopping so abruptly that his sister collided with his back. He pointed, and the woman turned, one hand instinctively reaching for her children while the other shaded her eyes against the sun. Xavier removed his hat and raised a hand in greeting, trying to appear as non-threatening as a trail-worn stranger could. "Madam," he called out, "name's Xavier Cole. My horse could use some water if you could spare it." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "The well's around back," she said, her voice carrying a hint of caution. "You're welcome to water your horse, Mr. Cole." As Xavier drew closer, he could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with eyes the color of summer grass and a face that, despite its wariness, held a quiet strength. "These your children, madam?" he asked, dismounting slowly. "They are." Her chin lifted slightly. "My son, James, and my daughter, Elizabeth." She placed a protective hand on each child's shoulder. "I'm Katherine Ward." Xavier nodded at the children, who stared back with curious eyes. "Pleased to meet you all." He led his horse toward the well she'd indicated. "It's a fine place you've got here, Mrs. Ward." "Miss," she corrected, following at a careful distance. "My husband died 2 winters ago, pneumonia." Xavier turned to look at her, recognition dawning in his eyes, a widow alone with 2 young children in this unforgiving country. It explained the subtle signs he'd noticed: the weathered fence posts that needed replacing, the overgrown garden, the barn door hanging slightly askew. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said simply. Catherine's eyes studied him, measuring and assessing. "Are you passing through, Mr. Cole, or do you have business in these parts?" Xavier drew water from the well, filling the trough for his horse before answering. "Passing through, I suppose, though I haven't decided where I'm headed next." The boy, James, had crept closer, fascinated by Xavier's horse and the worn leather holster at his hip. "Are you a gunslinger, Mr. James?" Katherine scolded. "Mind your manners." Xavier smiled, the expression feeling unfamiliar on his face. "No, son, I was a scout for the Army." "Now I'm just a man looking for a place to belong." Something in Katherine's expression softened slightly at his words. "Supper will be ready soon," she said after a moment. "If you'd care to join us, Mr. Cole, we have enough to share." The invitation surprised him. Lone women in the territories rarely welcomed strangers, and for good reason. "That's mighty kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," she replied. Consider it payment for a favor. Our woodpile needs tending, and it's hard work for a boy James's age. Xavier understood then. It wasn't charity she was offering, but a fair exchange, work for a meal. His respect for her grew. "I'd be obliged," he said with a nod, "and please call me Xavier." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Xavier split logs with practiced efficiency, the rhythmic swing of the axe loosening muscles tight from days in the saddle. James watched from a safe distance, his sister building a small fort from wood scraps nearby. Katherine appeared at the cabin door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Supper's ready," she called. The meal was simple venison stew, cornbread, and stewed apples, but it was the first home-cooked food Xavier had eaten in months, and he savored every bite. The children peppered him with questions about his travels, which he answered carefully, editing out the harsher realities of life on the frontier. "How did you learn to hunt, Mr. Xavier?" James asked, his eyes wide with admiration. "My father taught me when I was about your age," Xavier replied, surprised by how easily the memory came. "He was a trapper in Missouri before the war. Our pa was teaching me to hunt," James said proudly. "I can shoot a little." Katherine's face betrayed a flicker of concern. "James helps me set snares for rabbits," she explained, "though I'm not much of a shot myself." "A skill worth having out here," Xavier commented. "Perhaps I could check your rifle while I'm here, make sure it's in good working order." "That would be appreciated," Katherine said quietly. As darkness fell, Xavier prepared to take his leave, intending to make camp nearby, but Katherine surprised him again. "The barn has a decent loft with clean straw," she offered. "Your horse would be sheltered, and you'd be more comfortable than sleeping on the ground." Xavier hesitated. "Are you certain, Miss Ward? Some might talk if a stranger stayed on your property." Katherine's laugh was soft but tinged with bitterness. "Our nearest neighbors are 5 miles away, Mr. Cole. Out here, practicality matters more than propriety. You've been kind and respectful, and I trust my judgment of character." That night, stretched out in the loft with fresh straw beneath him and a borrowed blanket, Xavier found himself staring at the barn's rafters, thinking about Katherine Ward and her children. The longing he'd felt earlier hadn't diminished. If anything, sharing their table and witnessing their small family's quiet courage had only intensified it. For the first time in years, Xavier allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where he woke each morning with purpose beyond mere survival, where children's laughter replaced the echoes of gunfire in his memories. Dawn found him already at work, mending the loose barn door and reinforcing the chicken coop he'd noticed needed attention. Katherine emerged from the cabin, surprise evident on her face when she saw him. "You didn't have to do this," she said, watching as he hammered the last nail into place. "Wanted to," Xavier replied simply. "Your fence line could use some work too, if you don't mind me staying another day." Katherine studied him, her green eyes thoughtful. "Why would you do that?" Xavier paused, considering his answer. "Because everybody needs help sometimes, Miss Ward." "And I've been wandering so long, it feels good to be useful," she nodded slowly. "Then I accept, Mr. Cole, but you'll take your meals with us, and I insist on washing that shirt of yours. It looks like it could stand on its own by now." Xavier laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "Yes, madam." One day stretched into 3, then a week. Xavier repaired fences, patched the leaky cabin roof, and cleared the overgrown garden plot. In the evenings, he taught James how to properly clean and maintain the old rifle that had belonged to his father, and showed Elizabeth how to whittle simple toys from scraps of wood. Katherine watched the transformation in her children with mixed emotions. They had taken to Xavier immediately, starved for male attention and guidance. James followed him like a shadow, soaking up every lesson and story. Elizabeth had declared on the 3rd day that Xavier told better bedtime stories than anyone, a pronouncement that had brought an unexpected flush to the cowboy's weathered face. But it was the changes in herself that Katherine found most unsettling. She caught herself watching Xavier as he worked, admiring the strength in his shoulders and the gentleness in his hands when he helped Elizabeth climb the oak tree. She found herself lingering over conversations after the children were asleep. sharing her hopes for their future and listening to his stories of the places he'd seen. On the 10th day, while hanging laundry beneath the oak tree, Katherine finally acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Xavier Cole. The realization both terrified and exhilarated her. William had been gone for over 2 years, and while she had loved him deeply, loneliness had been her constant companion since his death. The prospect of opening her heart again felt like standing at the edge of a precipice. "You're quiet today," Xavier observed, appearing beside her with an armful of firewood. Katherine pinned a sheet to the line, buying time to compose herself. "Just thinking." "About what?" She met his gaze directly. "About how different things have been since you arrived." Xavier set down the wood, his expression serious. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that, Katherine." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. "I should have moved on days ago," he continued. "I've imposed on your hospitality too long." "You haven't imposed," she said quickly. "You've worked harder than any hired hand would have." "That's not what I meant." Xavier took a step closer. "Every day I stay makes it harder to leave." Katherine's heart quickened. "Then perhaps you shouldn't." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. "I'm not a farmer, Katherine. I've lived by my wits and my rifle for most of my adult life. What could I offer you and your children?" "Safety," she answered without hesitation. "Companionship. The children adore you and they need a father figure." "And what about you?" Xavier asked softly. "What do you need?" Katherine looked away, suddenly afraid of the intensity in his eyes. "I need someone I can trust. Someone who won't disappear when winter comes and the work gets harder." Xavier's hand gently turned her face back toward his. "I've been running from my past for too long. When I rode up that first day and saw you hanging laundry with your children playing nearby, something changed in me. I saw a family I wanted to call my own." Katherine's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "Xavier," the moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Xavier's hand dropped to his side as they both turned toward the road, where 3 riders were approaching at a steady pace. Xavier's posture changed instantly, a tension entering his body that Katherine had never seen before. "Take the children inside," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching men. "Who are they?" Katherine asked, already moving toward where James and Elizabeth were playing. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right." Katherine hurried the protesting children into the cabin, her heart racing as she watched through the window. Xavier stood his ground as the riders approached, his hand resting casually near the holster at his hip. The leader was a burly man with a thick beard and an expensive-looking hat. He reined his horse to a stop several yards from Xavier, the other 2 men flanking him. "Afternoon," Xavier called, his voice neutral. "Something I can help you gentlemen with." "Maybe," the bearded man replied, his eyes surveying the property. "I'm looking for a woman and 2 young uns, name of Ward." Xavier didn't move. "And you are Frank Byers. I own the Circle B Ranch about 20 miles east, and you didn't answer my question, friend." "The Wards live here," Xavier acknowledged. "Miss Ward is inside with her children. What's your business with them?" Byers' mouth twisted into what might have been a smile beneath his beard. "My business is with the widow, not with whatever drifter she's taken in. Tell her Frank Byers is here to discuss her situation." Xavier remained where he was, a subtle shift in his stance the only indication of his growing wariness. "I believe Miss Ward is aware of her situation. If you have something specific to discuss, you can tell me and I'll relay the message." The 2 men flanking Byers exchanged glances, hands moving subtly closer to their weapons. Inside the cabin, Katherine felt cold fear spreading through her chest. Frank Byers had approached her twice in the past year, offering to buy her land at a fraction of its worth. His ranch was expanding, and her small homestead stood in the way of his access to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property. "Last time I was here," Byers said, his voice hardening, "I made the widow a generous offer, told her to think it over. Time's up and I've come for her answer." "Miss Ward isn't interested in selling," Xavier replied evenly. And I'd appreciate it if you'd address her with the respect she deserves. Byers' face darkened. And who the hell are you to speak for her? Far as I know, you're nothing but a saddled tramp who's found himself a comfortable bed. Xavier's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. I'm the man asking you politely to leave this property, Mr. Byers. The tension crackled in the air like heat lightning. Katherine couldn't stand it any longer. She opened the cabin door, stepping onto the porch. Stay inside, Katherine, Xavier called without turning. It's all right, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Byers and I have spoken before. Byers turned his attention to her, his expression softening into something that made Katherine's skin crawl. Mrs. Ward, I see you found yourself some protection. Wise move for a woman alone, though you might have chosen better company. Mr. Cole is a friend who's been kind enough to help with repairs, Katherine said carefully. As for your offer, my answer hasn't changed. This land belonged to my husband, and it will belong to my son when he comes of age. Byers sighed dramatically. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Ward. A woman can't manage a homestead alone, and your friend here won't stay forever. His kind never do. That's not your concern, Katherine replied. Now, unless you have other business, I'll thank you to leave. We have work to do. For a moment, Byers looked as though he might argue further. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. As you wish, Mrs. Ward, but remember what I said. When winter comes and your supplies run low, my offer still stands. His eyes shifted to Xavier. For now. The three men wheeled their horses around and rode away, dust rising behind them. Only when they were well down the road did Xavier turn to Katherine, his face grim. How long has he been pressuring you to sell? Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon sun. Since William died. At first he was almost sympathetic, offering what he called a fair price for a widow in difficult circumstances. When I refused, he became more insistent. Xavier's jaw tightened. Has he threatened you? Not directly. But the last time he came, he mentioned how unfortunate it would be if anything happened to our livestock over the winter. A muscle worked in Xavier's cheek. He won't touch you or this land, he said, his voice low and certain. I promise you that. Katherine looked up at him, searching his face. You don't have to fight my battles, Xavier. No, he agreed, but I want to, if you'll let me. That evening, after the children were asleep, Katherine and Xavier sat on the porch steps, the golden light from the cabin's oil lamp casting long shadows across the yard. The encounter with Byers had shifted something between them, bringing an urgency to decisions that had been hovering just beyond conversation. Tell me about your husband, Xavier said quietly, Katherine's hands stilled in her lap. William was a good man, gentle, hardworking. He brought me out here from Chicago after we married. His dream was to build something that would last, something he could pass on to James. She smiled faintly at the memory. He wasn't particularly suited to frontier life. He'd been a bookkeeper back east, but he learned quickly. You loved him very much. It wasn't a question, but Katherine nodded. I did. His death was sudden. 1 week he was clearing land for spring planting, the next he was burning with fever. By the time I could get the doctor from town, it was too late. Xavier was silent for a moment, and after I did what women out here do, I survived. Katherine looked out at the darkened land that had been her home for 8 years. I learned to shoot, though not very well. I bartered with neighbors for help with the heaviest work. I told myself that if I could just hold on until James was old enough to take over, everything William worked for wouldn't be lost. And Byers, Katherine's expression hardened. Frank Byers thinks everything and everyone has a price. He can't understand why a helpless widow won't accept his charity and move to town where I belong. Xavier's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. You're the least helpless woman I've ever met, Katherine Ward. She turned to face him, suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting. Why did you stay, Xavier? The truth. He held her gaze steadily. When I first saw you hanging laundry with your children playing nearby, something inside me recognized what I'd been searching for, a home, a purpose. He paused, his voice dropping lower. A family, Katherine's heart pounded against her ribs, and now, after knowing us for these weeks, Now I'm certain, Xavier said simply. I love your children as if they were my own, and I'm falling in love with their mother. The confession hung in the night air between them. Katherine felt dizzy with hope and fear, all the careful walls she'd built around her heart crumbling under the weight of his words. I can't offer you wealth or an easy life, Xavier continued. But I can promise to protect you and the children, to work this land until my hands bleed if necessary, to never abandon what we could build together. Xavier, Katherine whispered, her voice breaking on his name, I'm afraid. Of what? Of believing in something and losing it again. Of letting James and Elizabeth love you, only to have you ride away someday when the wanderlust returns. Xavier took both her hands in his. Katherine, I've spent years wandering because I had nothing to anchor me. Now I do. He reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just the chance to prove myself to you. Katherine leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder. Stay, she whispered. Not in the barn, not as a hired hand. Stay with us with me, and we'll find the answer together. Xavier's arms came around her, strong and sure, and for the first time since William's death, Katherine felt the hollow place in her chest begin to fill with something warm and real. The following weeks brought changes to the Ward homestead. Xavier moved his few belongings from the barn to the small room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage. The arrangement was a compromise close enough to provide protection, separate enough to preserve Katherine's reputation should anyone from town visit. Not that Katherine particularly cared what the townspeople thought. Out here, survival mattered more than social niceties. But Xavier had insisted, saying that if their relationship progressed as he hoped, he wanted no one to be able to question her honor or his intentions. The children adjusted to Xavier's increased presence with unbridled enthusiasm. James proudly told everyone who would listen that Xavier was teaching him to track and hunt, while Elizabeth had taken to following Xavier around the property, helping with his daily chores. One afternoon in late October, Xavier took James hunting for the first time. They returned just before sunset, the boy practically bursting with pride as he carried a plump rabbit he had shot himself. Ma, look what I got. James called, racing toward the cabin where Katherine was teaching Elizabeth how to roll out dough for pie crust. Katherine wiped her hands on her apron, stepping onto the porch as Xavier approached more slowly behind James, his face split in a wide grin. It's nearly as big as you are, Katherine exclaimed, examining the rabbit. Did you really shoot it yourself? Yes, madam. Xavier showed me how to be patient and wait real still, and I only needed one shot. Katherine looked up at Xavier, who had reached the porch steps. You've made his year, she said softly. Xavier's eyes crinkled at the corners. He's a natural, steady hands and a good eye. He ruffled James's hair. Why don't you show your sister while I talk to your ma for a minute? As the children moved away, Xavier took Katherine's hand, leading her to the far end of the porch. I got news in town, he said, his expression growing serious. What is it? Katherine felt a flicker of anxiety. Byers has been talking. Making it known around town that he's concerned about a defenseless widow being taken advantage of by a drifter. Katherine's cheeks flushed with anger. How dare he? What business is it of his who stays on my property? It's not about you, Katherine. It's about the land. He's laying groundwork, trying to create sympathy for when he eventually makes his move. What move? Katherine asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Xavier sighed, leaning against the porch railing. Men like Byers don't like to lose. He wants your land, and he'll use whatever means necessary to get it. He can't force me to sell. No, but he can make life difficult enough that selling becomes your only option. Xavier's eyes were troubled. There's something else. I asked around about him. He's got the county commissioner in his pocket, and he's been expanding his ranch by acquiring properties with questionable deeds. Katherine's blood ran cold. William's deed is perfectly legal. We filed it with the land office in Helena. I believe you, Xavier assured her. But legal doesn't always mean protected, not out here where the law is whatever the man with the most money or guns says it is. Katherine paced the length of the porch, her mind racing. What do we do? Xavier was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that. There's a solution, but I'm not sure you're ready to hear it. Katherine stopped pacing, turning to face him. Tell me, marry me. The words fell between them like stones in still water. Katherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? Xavier crossed the space between them, taking her hands in his. Marry me, Katherine. As your husband, I would have legal right to defend this property. Buyers couldn't question my presence here, and any attempt to challenge the deed would have to go through me. You want to marry me to protect the land? Katherine pulled her hands away, unexpectedly hurt. Xavier's expression softened. No, Katherine, I want to marry you, because I love James and Elizabeth, because I want to build a life with you. He touched her cheek gently. The fact that it would also protect what's yours is just an added benefit. Katherine's heart raced. In the weeks since Xavier had first confessed his feelings, their relationship had deepened in quiet ways, shared glances across the dinner table, hands touching while working side by side, conversations that stretched long into the night. She had known they were moving toward something permanent, but she hadn't expected this moment to come so soon. It's too fast, she whispered, though part of her disagreed. We've known each other barely 2 months. Some people know in 2 minutes what others never figure out in a lifetime, Xavier replied. I'm not asking you to forget William or to pretend what we have is the same as what you shared with him. I'm asking you to take a chance on building something new. Katherine looked out at the land that had been her home and prison for so long, the land that held William's dreams and her children's future. The land that, for the first time since her husband's death, had begun to feel like a home again rather than a burden. Yes, she said suddenly, turning back to Xavier. Yes, I'll marry you. The joy that transformed Xavier's face made Katherine's breath catch. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that drove away any lingering doubts. I promise you won't regret this, he whispered against her hair. I know, Katherine replied and realized she meant it. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in town. It was a simple affair, Katherine in her best dress, Xavier in a new shirt and polished boots, the children scrubbed clean and wide-eyed with excitement. The preacher spoke the traditional words while a handful of neighbors Katherine had traded with over the years watched from the pews. Word had spread quickly about the widow Ward's marriage to the former Army scout who had appeared as if from nowhere. Some tongues wagged about the hasty courtship, but most frontier communities understood that practical considerations often drove such decisions. A woman alone with children needed a husband, a man without roots needed a family. It was the way of things in a land where survival depended on mutual support. What the gossips couldn't see was the way Xavier's hand trembled slightly as he placed the simple gold band on Katherine's finger, or the tears that shimmered in her eyes as she spoke her vows. They couldn't know about the quiet conversations that had filled the intervening weeks, the careful plans laid for their future together, the growing certainty that what had begun as chance was blossoming into something profound and lasting. After a small celebration at the hotel restaurant, the new family returned home. As Xavier lifted Elizabeth, who had fallen asleep on the ride, from the wagon, Katherine was struck by how natural it all seemed, as if Xavier had always been part of their lives rather than a stranger who had ridden up to her clothes line a few short months ago. That night, after the children were asleep, Katherine stood nervously in the bedroom that had once been hers and William's, now freshly painted and rearranged by Xavier's hands to mark the beginning of their new life together. Her wedding night with William had been in a Chicago hotel, both of them young and inexperienced. Now, as a widow of 27 remarrying, Katherine felt an entirely different kind of anticipation. When Xavier entered the room, his eyes found hers immediately. He had shaved and combed his hair, and Katherine was struck again by how handsome he was, not in the polished way of city men, but with the weathered strength of someone who had faced the elements and survived. Having second thoughts? He asked softly, noticing her expression. Katherine shook her head. No, just remembering who I was the last time I became a wife and thinking about how different I am now. Xavier crossed to her, taking her hands in his. We're both different from who we might have been in another life, but I think that's why we found each other." Katherine leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I never expected to love again," she confessed. "After William died, I thought that part of me was finished." Xavier's arms encircled her. "And now I know better," she whispered, tilting her face up to his. "Love doesn't end. It changes, makes room for more." When Xavier's lips met hers, Katherine felt the last shadows of doubt dissolve like morning mist. This was right. This was home. Winter descended on the Montana territory with icy determination. Snow blanketed the land, transforming the homestead into a white island surrounded by endless drifts. Inside the cabin, life took on a different rhythm, more contained, more intimate. Xavier repaired harnesses and tools in the evenings while Katherine sewed or taught Elizabeth her letters. James practiced his reading aloud from the few books they owned, proudly showing off his improving skills to his new stepfather. The transition hadn't been without challenges. James sometimes woke from nightmares calling for his father, momentarily confused when Xavier appeared instead. Elizabeth occasionally tested boundaries, seeing how far she could push her new parent before facing consequences. And Katherine herself had moments of guilt, wondering if she had betrayed William's memory by finding happiness again so quickly, but Xavier's patience never wavered. He listened when James needed to talk about memories of his father. He established gentle but firm limits for Elizabeth that made her feel secure rather than restricted. And with Katherine, he was unfailingly tender, giving her space when memories overwhelmed her, holding her close when she needed reassurance. One evening in early December, as a blizzard raged outside, the family sat around the fire after dinner. Elizabeth was dozing in Xavier's lap while he told James stories about his days as an Army scout. "Were you ever scared?" James asked, eyes wide with admiration. Xavier considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said finally, "many times. Being brave doesn't mean not feeling fear, James. It means doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." Katherine looked up from her mending, struck by the simple wisdom of his words and how perfectly they captured the man himself. Xavier had faced countless dangers in his past life, yet what had truly required courage was stopping his wandering to build a life with them. Later, after the children were asleep and they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Katherine traced the scar that ran along Xavier's ribs, a souvenir from a Cheyenne arrow years before. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly, the freedom of the trail answering to no one. Xavier was silent for a moment. "I miss certain things," he admitted. "The quiet of dawn in an untouched valley, the sense of discovery when you crest a ridge and see land no white man has mapped, but those were lonely pleasures." His hand found hers, bringing it to his lips. "What I have now is worth infinitely more." Katherine nestled closer to him, taking comfort in his warmth. "Frank Byers hasn't made any moves since our wedding." "He's waiting," Xavier replied, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. "Men like him play the long game. He thinks winter will weaken us, make us desperate enough to consider his offer." "Will it?" Xavier's arm tightened around her. "No, we've got enough supplies to last until spring, and the root cellar is full. The livestock are sheltered, and we've got plenty of firewood." He kissed the top of her head. "We're going to be fine, Katherine, better than fine," she believed him. For the first time in years, Katherine allowed herself to think beyond mere survival, to imagine a future where the homestead thrived, where James and Elizabeth grew up strong and confident, where she and Xavier grew old together, watching the seasons change across land that was truly their home. January brought the coldest weather Katherine could remember. The creek froze solid, and even at midday, the sun seemed distant and pale in the vast blue sky. Xavier took to sleeping in the barn on the harshest nights, ensuring the animals remained warm enough to survive. It was during one such night that Katherine awoke to the smell of smoke. At first, she thought it was from the banked fire in the hearth. Then she realized the acrid scent was too strong, too close. She threw back the covers, rushing to the window. Orange flames licked at the side of the barn, spreading rapidly in the dry winter air. "Xavier," she screamed, terror seizing her. Her husband was in that barn, along with their horses and milk cow, their lifeline during the winter months. Katherine threw on her coat over her nightgown and shoved her feet into boots. "James, Elizabeth, wake up," she called, moving quickly to the children's room. "The barn's on fire." James sat up immediately, years of frontier life having taught him the dangers of fire. "Pa?" he asked, using the name he had only recently begun to call Xavier. "He's in the barn," Katherine said, her voice tight with fear. "Help your sister get dressed warmly and stay in the house until I call you." Outside, the night air hit Katherine like a physical blow, so cold it stole her breath. The barn was now fully engulfed, flames shooting toward the star-filled sky. She ran toward it, calling Xavier's name, when suddenly a figure burst through the small side door, leading the terrified horses and cow. Xavier's face was blackened with soot, his coat singed in places. "Get back!" he shouted, coughing. "The roof's about to go." As if summoned by his words, there was a tremendous crack, and part of the barn's roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the night. Xavier hurried the animals toward the corral, then rushed to Katherine's side. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his hands checking her for injury even as she did the same to him. "I'm fine," Katherine assured him, relief making her dizzy. "The children are inside. What happened?" Xavier's expression darkened. "This wasn't an accident. I smelled coal oil before I saw the flames." Katherine's blood ran cold. "Buyers? Can't prove it yet, but who else would benefit from destroying our barn in the dead of winter?" Xavier ran a hand through his ash-covered hair. "He thinks without shelter for the animals, we'll be forced to sell them off cheap. Without the horses, we can't plow in spring." "What do we do?" Xavier looked at the burning barn, his jaw set in grim determination. "First, we make sure the fire doesn't spread to the house. Then we figure out how to keep the animals alive until we can rebuild." For the rest of the night, they fought to contain the fire, using snow to prevent it from reaching the nearby woodpile or outbuildings. James helped by bringing water from the well, his young face serious beyond his years. By dawn, the barn was nothing but a smoldering shell, but the rest of the homestead had been saved. As the weak winter sun crested the horizon, Xavier stood with his arm around Katherine's shoulders, surveying the damage. "He thinks this will break us," he said quietly. Katherine leaned into his strength. "It won't." "No," Xavier agreed. "It won't." Word of the fire spread quickly through the scattered homesteads. By noon, 3 neighboring families had arrived with offers of help. The Petersons, whose farm lay 2 miles west, offered to shelter the milk cow until spring. The Hoffmans brought extra feed for the horses, which Xavier had temporarily housed in the small tool shed. Old man Jenkins, who lived alone on the next property, arrived with his 2 grown sons and lumber from trees they had felled the previous summer. "Thought you might need this sooner than we would," Jenkins said gruffly, nodding at the wagon piled with rough cut boards. "Barn raising as soon as the weather breaks a bit." Katherine fought back tears at the show of frontier solidarity. These were people she had known only in passing before William's death, exchanging brief greetings at the general store or church. Yet here they were, offering what they could to help a neighbor in need. That evening, after the visitors had gone and the children were asleep, Xavier and Katherine sat at the kitchen table, making plans. The animals were safe for now, and with the promised help, they could rebuild the barn when the worst of winter passed. But the loss of stored hay and feed would make the coming months lean. "We'll manage," Xavier said, his hand covering hers on the tabletop. "The hunting's been good this winter. We can smoke more meat to trade for grain if necessary." Katherine nodded, but a worry had been growing in her mind all day. "What if it happens again? What if next time it's the house instead of the barn?" Xavier's expression hardened. "I've been thinking about that. I'm going to ride into town tomorrow, have a talk with the sheriff, and say what? We have no proof Byers was behind this. No proof, but plenty of motive, and if I make it clear that we know what he's doing, he might back off." Xavier squeezed her hand. "At the very least, it puts the law on notice. If anything else happens, there's an established pattern." Katherine wasn't convinced. "Sheriff Davis gets his re-election funds from the big ranchers, Byers included. Then I'll go straight to buyers, Xavier said, a dangerous edge entering his voice. Make it clear that if he wants this land, he'll have to come through me to get it, and I'm a lot harder to intimidate than a woman alone. Katherine stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the moonlit snow. I hate this, she said quietly. I hate that our happiness has to be defended with threats and posturing. Xavier came up behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. It's the way of things out here, Katherine. Land and power go to those willing to fight for them. I know. She turned in his arms. But I don't want you riding into danger because of us. I've buried one husband. I couldn't bear to bury another. Xavier's face softened. Katherine, this isn't just about defending you and the children, though I do that with my last breath. It's about defending what's ours. What we're building together. He cupped her face in his calloused hands. I'm not the same man who rode up to your clothesline last fall. That man had nothing to lose. I have everything to lose now, which means I'll be twice as careful. Katherine searched his eyes and found only steady resolve. Promise me you won't do anything reckless. I promise. He sealed the vow with a kiss that grounded her, reminding her that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Xavier dressed with care, choosing his warmest clothes for the ride into town. As he strapped on his gun belt, something he rarely wore around the homestead, Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety. Be back before dark, she said, handing him a package of food for the journey. The temperature drops too quickly after sunset. Xavier nodded, pulling on his gloves. I'll be quick about my business. He kissed her, then crouched to embrace James and Elizabeth. Mind your mother while I'm gone, he told them. I'm counting on you to help with the animals. As Xavier rode away, Katherine stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared from sight. Then she turned to the children with forced cheerfulness. Well, we have work to do. Let's get started. The day passed in a blur of chores. Katherine tried to keep her worry at bay by staying busy, but as afternoon waned toward evening with no sign of Xavier, her anxiety grew. She found herself checking the road more frequently, straining to hear the sound of hoofbeats over the winter silence. Is Pa coming back soon? Elizabeth asked as Katherine prepared supper, her small face creased with concern. Of course he is, sweetheart, Katherine assured her, though her own doubts were mounting. He probably had more business in town than he expected. When full darkness fell and Xavier still hadn't returned, Katherine put the children to bed with promises that their stepfather would be there when they woke. Alone in the kitchen, she paced, alternating between fear and anger. Had something happened to him on the trail? Had there been trouble in town? Or had he simply decided their problems were too much and ridden away? No, she rejected that thought immediately. Xavier would never abandon them. Whatever was keeping him, it wasn't by choice. Just as Katherine was considering whether to saddle the remaining horse and go looking for him, she heard the distant sound of hooves approaching. She rushed to the window, relief flooding through her as she recognized Xavier's broad-shouldered silhouette in the moonlight. She threw open the door, rushing out into the cold without a coat. Where have you been? I was worried sick. Xavier dismounted slowly, and Katherine realized with a jolt that he was favoring his right side. Had some trouble in town, he said, his voice tight with what she recognized as pain. You're hurt. Katherine moved quickly to his side, supporting him as he limped toward the house. What happened? Inside, under the lamplight, she could see the full extent of the damage. Xavier's face was bruised, a cut above his eye crusted with dried blood. He winced as he removed his coat, revealing a tear in his shirt where a knife, Katherine realized with horror, had sliced across his ribs. It looks worse than it is, Xavier said, seeing her expression. Just a scratch and some bruises. Who did this? Katherine demanded, already gathering water and clean cloths to tend his wounds. Xavier sighed, easing himself into a chair. Byers' men. 3 of them caught me coming out of the sheriff's office. Said they wanted to teach the uppity drifter a lesson about making accusations against respectable citizens. Katherine's hands stilled. You spoke to the sheriff? I did. Xavier grimaced as she began cleaning the cut above his eye, for all the good it did. Davis listened politely, said he'd look into it, and showed me the door. And then buyer's men were waiting for you. It wasn't a question, Xavier nodded. They followed me to the saloon, waited until I was leaving. Wouldn't have been a problem except they had the advantage of numbers. Did you fight back? Katherine asked carefully. A grim smile touched Xavier's lips. Two of them won't be comfortable riding for a week or so. The third might need a new front tooth. The smile faded, but that's not the important part. While we were discussing things, one of them let slip something interesting. Katherine set aside the bloodied cloth, reaching for a clean one. What? Buyers has filed a claim with the land office challenging our deed. Says the original survey was faulty and part of this property actually falls within the boundaries of his original grant. Xavier caught her hand. It's nonsense, of course, but it ties up the legal status of the land while the claim is investigated. Can he do that? With enough money and the right connections, yes. Xavier's eyes were serious. It's a delaying tactic. Spring planting is only a few months away. If we can't establish clear title by then, we can't legally work the land. Katherine sat back, her mind racing. We have the original deed. William registered it properly. And we'll fight the claim, Xavier assured her. But buyers is counting on wearing us down, on making the fight so costly and exhausting that selling becomes the easier option. Katherine felt a surge of anger so intense it nearly took her breath away. He underestimates what this land means to us. Yes, Xavier agreed, his hand finding hers. He does. That night, as Xavier slept restlessly beside her, Katherine stared at the ceiling, thinking. For too long she had been reactive, responding to crises as they arose. It was time to take control of their situation, to become the aggressor rather than the defender. As dawn broke, Katherine had formed a plan. While Xavier split wood insisting he was well enough for light work despite his injuries, she bundled the children warmly and hitched the remaining horse to the small sleigh William had built for winter travel. "Where are you going?" Xavier asked, setting down the axe. "To see Martha Jenkins," Katherine replied, naming the elderly widow whose property adjoined Old Man Jenkins's land. "She might have information that could help us." Xavier looked skeptical. "What kind of information? Martha has lived here longer than anyone." "She came with the first wave of settlers 30 years ago." Katherine tucked a hot brick wrapped in flannel beneath the sleigh blankets to keep the children's feet warm. "If anyone knows the history of land grants in this area, it's her." Xavier seemed about to argue, then nodded. "Be careful. The trail to her place crosses open ground. If the wind picks up, I know," Katherine interrupted gently. "We'll be fine, and we'll be back before dark." The journey to Martha Jenkins's small cabin took nearly 2 hours. The old woman was surprised to see visitors in such weather but welcomed them warmly, fussing over the children and insisting Katherine accept a jar of preserved peaches. "Now," Martha said once they were settled with hot tea, "what brings you out in this cold, Katherine Cole? Must be important." Katherine explained about buyer's claim and the barn fire, watching as Martha's weathered face grew increasingly troubled. "That man," the old woman muttered, "been causing trouble since he arrived 5 years ago. Thinks because he's got money, he can bully folks into giving him what he wants." "Have you heard anything about land disputes with him before?" Katherine asked. Martha nodded slowly. "The Wilkinsons, 2 years back, nice young couple with a new baby. Buyers wanted their water rights. When they wouldn't sell, suddenly there was a question about their deed. Next thing you know, their cabin burned down in the night. Terrible tragedy." Her eyes hardened. "Nobody could prove anything, of course, but the Wilkinsons sold out for a pittance and moved back east." Katherine felt sick. "What about his claim that the original surveys were faulty?" Martha snorted. "Hogwash. The government surveyors who mapped this territory were meticulous. My late husband assisted them, carried their equipment. Every boundary was marked with permanent stakes and recorded in triplicate." A glimmer of hope sparked in Katherine. "Do those records still exist?" "Should be at the county courthouse in Helena," Martha replied, "though getting access might not be easy without the right connections." Katherine thought for a moment. "What about your husband's notes or journals? Did he keep any records of his work with the surveyors?" Martha's eyes widened. Why, yes, Jacob kept detailed diaries, never thought they'd be of use to anyone but family historians. She rose slowly, moving to an old trunk in the corner of the cabin. Let me see if I can find the right one. After some rummaging, Martha produced a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This would be from 1852 when they surveyed this section. Jacob marked everything: landmarks, distances, even the names of property assignations as they were made. Katherine accepted the journal with reverent hands. May I borrow this? It could be crucial evidence if buyer's claim goes to hearing. Martha nodded. Take it. Jacob would be pleased to know his work might help stop a land grabber like Byers. She fixed Katherine with a shrewd look. But be careful, dear. Men like that don't take kindly to being thwarted. On the journey home, Katherine's mind raced with possibilities. If Jacob Jenkins's journal provided clear evidence that the original survey was accurate, Byers' claim would collapse. But would it be enough to stop him permanently? Or would he simply find another avenue of attack? Xavier was waiting anxiously when they returned, relief evident on his face as he helped lift the children from the sleigh. Once they were inside and warming by the fire, Katherine showed him the journal. Martha says her husband assisted the original survey team, she explained. His notes could prove that Byers' claim about faulty boundaries is fabricated. Xavier examined the careful handwriting, the detailed maps and measurements. This is good, Katherine, very good, but using it means taking the fight directly to Byers, challenging him publicly. His eyes met hers. Are you ready for that? Katherine squared her shoulders. I'm tired of living in fear of what he might do next. Yes, I'm ready. Xavier's slow smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Then we'll do it together. The next few weeks passed in careful preparation. Xavier made 2 more trips to town, returning with legal documents from the land office and information about the process for contesting Byers' claim. Katherine pored over Jacob Jenkins's journal, matching his descriptions to landmarks she knew, building a mental map of the original survey that confirmed what she had always believed: their land was exactly where and what the deed said it was. As February gave way to March, the weather began to moderate. The snow melted in patches, revealing the first hints of green beneath. True to their word, the neighbors arrived to help rebuild the barn, the work proceeding quickly with so many hands. Xavier worked alongside them, his injuries healed, his determination to secure their future stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier took Katherine's hand. I've been thinking, he said, his voice thoughtful, about what happens after we win this fight with Byers. Katherine raised an eyebrow. Confident are we? Xavier grinned. With you as my partner, absolutely. His expression grew more serious. But I've been wondering if this is the right place for us long term. A flicker of alarm went through Katherine. This is our home. Yes, Xavier agreed quickly. And I'm not suggesting we abandon it, but this land was William's dream, Katherine. I've been wondering if perhaps we should consider what our dream might be. Katherine was silent, turning his words over in her mind. It was true that the homestead had always felt like an extension of William, his vision, his work, his legacy for James. She had fought to keep it out of loyalty to him and security for their children. But what did she want for herself, for her new family? What are you suggesting? She asked finally. Xavier gestured toward the western horizon. There's unclaimed land beyond Jenkins's property following the creek. Good water, sheltered valley, enough timber for building, land that could be ours, not just something I stepped into. He looked at her intently. We could expand, Katherine, keep this homestead for James when he's grown, but build something new alongside it, something that belongs to all of us. The idea bloomed in Katherine's mind like a spring flower, not abandonment of William's dream, but an expansion of it. A way to honor the past while creating a future that included Xavier fully, not just as a caretaker of another man's vision. I'd like that, she said softly. Very much. Xavier's smile was worth every hardship they had endured. Then that's what we'll do, as soon as Byers is dealt with. The hearing at the county land office was set for the first week of April. Xavier and Katherine traveled to Helena together, leaving the children in Martha Jenkins's care. They brought William's original deed, Jacob Jenkins's journal, and statements from 3 longtime residents confirming the accuracy of the property boundaries. Frank Byers was waiting when they arrived, flanked by a lawyer from Butt and the 3 men who had attacked Xavier in town. He looked surprised to see Katherine, having clearly expected to face Xavier alone. "Mrs. Cole," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness, "this is hardly a suitable place for a lady. Property disputes can become quite technical." Katherine met his gaze steadily. "This is my land, Mr. Byers. I believe that makes this precisely where I should be." The land commissioner, a harried-looking man named Hollister, called the hearing to order. Byers' lawyer presented their claim, first a lengthy, jargon-filled argument about surveying errors and boundary adjustments that Katherine suspected was designed to confuse rather than clarify. When their turn came, Xavier spoke simply and directly, producing the original deed and explaining its provenance. Then he introduced Katherine, who opened Jacob Jenkins's journal to carefully marked pages. "Mr. Jenkins assisted the government survey team personally," she explained, her voice clear and confident. "His journal records the exact placement of boundary markers on what is now our property." She turned to a hand-drawn map. "As you can see, these markers correspond precisely to our deed description and have remained unchanged since 1852. Byers' lawyer tried to object, questioning the authenticity of a convenient journal, but Commissioner Hollister overruled him. "I knew Jacob Jenkins," the commissioner said. "His reputation for accuracy was unimpeachable." He examined the journal carefully. "These notes are consistent with the official survey records." By mid-afternoon, it was clear which way the decision would go. Byers sat with increasing discomfort as his claim unraveled under the weight of historical evidence. When Hollister finally rendered his verdict, confirming the validity of the Ward Cole deed and dismissing Byers' claim, Katherine felt a wave of vindication so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. Outside the land office, Xavier squeezed her hand. "You were magnificent," he whispered. Katherine was about to reply when Byers approached, his face dark with barely controlled anger. "Congratulations," he said coldly. "You've won this round, but Montana is changing, Mrs. Cole. Small homesteads like yours are becoming obsolete. The future belongs to large operations with the capital to weather bad years." "Perhaps," Katherine replied, "but our future is ours to determine, Mr. Byers, not yours." Byers' eyes shifted to Xavier. "You think you've found yourself a protector, but men like him don't stay put. When he tires of playing farmer and moves on, remember my offer still stands." Xavier stepped forward, his voice low but carrying. "I fought Apaches and Sioux for the Army, Byers. Compared to them, you're just a man with too much money and too little honor." His hand rested casually near his holster. "Stay away from my family and our land. This is your only warning." Something in Xavier's tone, the absolute certainty behind the words, seemed to penetrate Byers' arrogance. He studied Xavier for a long moment, then nodded curtly and walked away, his men following. "Will that be the end of it?" Katherine asked as they watched him go. Xavier sighed. "For now, men like Byers don't give up easily, but they also don't waste resources on lost causes. As long as we remain vigilant and prosperous, he'll likely look for easier targets." They collected their horses from the livery stable and began the journey home, riding side by side through the greening countryside. Katherine felt lighter than she had in months, as if a shadow had been lifted from their future. "What you said to Byers," she said after they had ridden in comfortable silence for a while, "about him assuming you'd leave someday." Xavier glanced over at her. "Yes, you seemed very certain." "I am certain." Xavier reined his horse closer to hers. "Katherine, I spent years wandering because I was looking for something without knowing what it was. The moment I saw you hanging laundry with your children playing nearby, I recognized it." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand. "Home isn't a place, it's people, it's family, it's purpose. I found all of that with you." Katherine blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the simple truth in his words. I love you, Xavier Cole. His smile was brighter than the spring sunshine. And I love you, Katherine Cole, until my last breath. They returned to the homestead the following day to find the children eagerly awaiting them, full of stories about their time with Martha and anxious to hear about the hearing. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Xavier at one end, Katherine at the other, James and Elizabeth between them, Katherine looked at the family they had become and felt profound gratitude. I have news, she announced as they finished their meal. Something Xavier and I have been discussing. The children looked up with interest. We're going to expand the homestead, Katherine continued, file a claim on the land beyond Mr. Jenkins's property and build a new house there. Are we moving? James asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Xavier shook his head. Not exactly, son. This place will always be part of our land, part of your inheritance, but we're going to grow, build something that belongs to all of us. Will I get my own room? Elizabeth asked, bouncing in her seat. Katherine laughed. Yes, sweetheart. You'll have your own room. Can I help build it? James looked at Xavier eagerly. Couldn't do it without you, Xavier assured him. It'll be a family project from the foundation to the roof. Later, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Katherine stood on the porch, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed at the star-filled sky. Are you happy? Xavier asked softly. Katherine leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Happier than I ever thought possible after William died, she answered honestly. You gave that back to me, Xavier, you and your wandering spirit that somehow found its way to my clothesline. Xavier chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. Best detour I ever took. Katherine closed her eyes, savoring the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: spring planting, planning their expansion, the 1,000 tasks that made up life on the frontier. But tonight, in the circle of her husband's arms, with their children sleeping safely nearby, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that they would face whatever came together. The wandering cowboy had found his home, and the widow hanging laundry had found a second chance at love. In the vast, untamed landscape of the Montana Territory, they had built something precious and enduring, a family that belonged to both their pasts and their shared future. As summer approached, the new barn stood completed, a testament to community solidarity and Xavier's careful planning. It was larger than the original, with expanded stalls for the horses and a proper tack room. Katherine often found herself pausing in her chores to admire it, seeing in its solid construction a symbol of their resilience. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of their property swelled with snowmelt, providing abundant water for the newly planted fields. Xavier had purchased additional seed in Helena, expanding their usual crops to include more vegetables and a small apple orchard that would take years to mature, but would someday provide fruit for preserves and cider. Katherine watched the transformation of their land with a sense of wonder. What had been William's modest homestead was evolving into something more ambitious under Xavier's guidance. Yet he was careful to include James in every decision, teaching the boy about crop rotation and soil management, ensuring that William's legacy remained intact even as they built upon it. In late May, Xavier rode to Jenkins's property to discuss their plans for expansion. He returned with news that the old man was considering selling his own land and moving to Oregon, where his daughter had settled. He offered us first refusal, Xavier told Katherine that evening as they sat on the porch. Said he'd rather see his place go to neighbors who would work it properly than have it swallowed up by some big operation. Katherine's eyes widened. Could we afford it? Xavier nodded. The price is fair, and I've been saving from my army days. Plus, the cattle we bought with last year's crop surplus are doing well. He took her hand. It would mean postponing building our new house, focusing instead on consolidating the combined properties. Katherine considered the proposition. It makes sense, she said slowly. Jenkins's land connects ours to the unclaimed valley you were eyeing. We could establish a much larger operation with room for everything we've talked about: more cattle, better pasture, maybe even horses someday. Xavier's face lit up at her understanding. Exactly. And James would have a substantial inheritance when he comes of age, not just his father's original homestead, but a thriving ranch built around it. The decision was made, and by midsummer, the papers were signed. Jenkins's modest cabin and outbuildings became part of the expanded Cole property, providing additional storage space and housing for the hired hand Xavier brought on to help with the increased workload. The first year of their marriage had brought challenges neither could have anticipated, but as their first anniversary approached in October, Katherine marveled at how seamlessly their lives had merged. Xavier had proven himself not just a capable rancher but a patient father, spending hours teaching James to ride and hunt, reading stories to Elizabeth each night, never distinguishing between biological connection and the bonds of chosen family. And their love had deepened in ways Katherine hadn't thought possible. The initial attraction that had drawn them together had matured into something more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of intimacy that comes from facing adversity side by side. One crisp autumn evening, as they walked the boundaries of their expanded property, Katherine paused at the top of a gentle rise that overlooked the meandering creek. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, highlighting the rich colors of changing leaves. "I want to build our house here," she said suddenly. Xavier looked around, assessing the location with a practiced eye. "Good spot, natural windbreak from those cottonwoods, plenty of morning sun, easy access to water," he smiled at her. "You've developed quite an eye for land, Mrs. Cole." Katherine returned his smile. "I had an excellent teacher." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When I think about where I was a year ago, how frightened and alone I felt." She shook her head. "It seems like a different lifetime." Xavier wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they gazed out over what was now their domain. "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you hanging laundry under that oak tree?" "What?" "I thought you were the strongest woman I'd ever seen. Standing so straight despite the weight on your shoulders, creating order and beauty in your small corner of the world." He turned her gently to face him. "I fell in love with your courage before I even knew your name." Katherine touched his face, tracing the lines that sun and wind had etched around his eyes. "And I fell in love with your kindness, the way you saw what needed doing and simply did it, without expectation of reward." As dusk deepened around them, they made their way back to the cabin that had been Katherine and William's home, now the first chapter in a larger story they were writing together. The lamp glowed in the window, a beacon guiding them home to where James and Elizabeth waited, their voices raised in laughter as the hired hand, a good-natured young man named Thomas, taught them a card game. "This is what matters," Xavier said softly as they approached. "Not the land or the buildings or the cattle. This." He nodded toward the warm light and the sounds of happiness emanating from within. "Family." Katherine squeezed his hand in silent agreement. The wandering cowboy who had once lived by his wits and his rifle had found his true calling as a husband and father. And she, the widow who had fought so hard to maintain her independence, had discovered that the right partnership made her stronger, not weaker. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, a home where love was the foundation, courage the framework, and hope the roof that sheltered them all. As winter settled once more over the Montana territory, bringing with it shorter days and long, firelit evenings, Xavier and Katherine began planning in earnest for the house they would build in spring. Seated at the kitchen table, they sketched ideas on paper, debating the merits of various layouts and features. 4 bedrooms, Katherine insisted. 1 for us, 1 each for James and Elizabeth, and 1 for... She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Xavier looked up from the rough drawing he was making, his eyebrows raised in question. "For guests," he suggested. Katherine met his gaze steadily. "Or for additions to the family." Understanding dawned in Xavier's eyes. "Katherine, are you?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "The baby will come in early summer. Dr. Morgan confirmed it when we were in town last week." Xavier was around the table in an instant, lifting Katherine from her chair and spinning her in a circle, his face alight with joy. "A baby," he whispered, setting her down gently. "Our baby." The emphasis on the word "our" wasn't lost on Katherine. Though Xavier had embraced James and Elizabeth as his own from the beginning, this child would be different, a physical manifestation of their union, a new branch on their family tree. "Are you happy?" she asked, searching his face. Xavier's answer was a kiss that left no room for doubt, followed by a fervent, "More than I can say." They shared the news with the children the following day. James received it with the pragmatic curiosity of a 9-year-old, immediately wanting to know if the baby would be a boy he could teach to fish. Elizabeth was ecstatic, declaring that she had always wanted to be a big sister and immediately beginning to plan how she would help care for the infant. As Katherine's pregnancy progressed, the harsh Montana winter gradually gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing new growth beneath, and the creek ran high with clear, cold water. Xavier began preparations for building their new home, cutting and seasoning timber, consulting with a mason from town about the foundation and fireplace. Katherine watched the activity with a sense of contentment that deepened as the child within her grew. This pregnancy was different from her previous ones, not just because she was older, but because the circumstances were so changed. With William, they had been young and uncertain, facing the challenges of frontier life together, but often feeling overwhelmed. Now, with Xavier, there was a confidence born of experience and mutual support. The new house took shape slowly but steadily throughout the spring. Neighbors came to help with the raising of the frame, just as they had with the barn. Katherine's condition prevented her from participating as actively as she would have liked, but she contributed by keeping workers fed and offering input on the design as construction progressed. By early June, the exterior was complete, a handsome 2-story structure of timber and stone that commanded the rise overlooking the creek. The interior remained unfinished, but Xavier worked tirelessly to prepare at least their bedroom and the nursery before the baby's arrival. As her time drew near, Katherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The lonely widow hanging laundry and the road-weary cowboy seeking rest had forged something beautiful from chance and necessity, transforming separate paths of grief and wandering into a shared journey of purpose and joy. The baby came on a warm July evening as the last light of day painted the new house in golden hues. Martha Jenkins served as midwife, her experienced hands guiding Katherine through the familiar yet always new process of bringing life into the world. Xavier paced the cabin's main room, wearing a path in the floorboards as James watched with wide eyes, and Elizabeth peppered him with questions he was too distracted to answer properly. When Martha finally called him in, Xavier approached the bedside with a reverence that brought tears to Katherine's eyes. In her arms lay a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair, a perfect blend of them both. "You have a son," Katherine said softly, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one calloused finger gently touching the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful," he whispered, "like his mother. Would you like to hold him?" The look of alarm that crossed Xavier's face made Katherine laugh. "I've never held one so new," he admitted. "What if I do it wrong?" "You won't," Katherine assured him, demonstrating how to support the baby's head as she transferred him to Xavier's arms. The sight of her husband, this strong, capable man who had faced countless dangers without flinching, cradling their newborn son with such tender uncertainty, filled Katherine with a love so intense it was almost painful. "What shall we call him?" Xavier asked, his eyes never leaving the tiny face. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one, wanting to meet their child first. Now, looking at the baby's features, the shape of his eyes reminiscent of Xavier, the curve of his mouth echoing Katherine, a name came to her. "Samuel," she said. "It means asked of God." "Because he is the answer to prayers we didn't even know we were making," Xavier nodded, a suspicion of moisture in his eyes. "Samuel Cole, welcome to the world, son." The children were allowed in then, approaching the bed with unusual quietness. Elizabeth's face was a picture of wonder as she leaned over to examine her new brother. James hung back slightly, his expression more reserved until Xavier beckoned him closer. "What do you think, James? Ready to be a big brother again?" The boy nodded solemnly. "I'll teach him everything I know, just like you've taught me." Xavier's free arm went around James's shoulders, pulling him close. "That's exactly what he'll need." As night fell fully, Martha shooed Xavier and the children out to let Katherine rest. But later, when the house was quiet and the first stars had appeared in the velvet sky, Xavier returned to sit beside her, Samuel sleeping peacefully between them. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice husky with emotion. Katherine reached across the baby to take his hand. "For what?" "For everything. For taking in a stranger when you had every reason to be cautious, for trusting me with your children, for loving me despite my past, for giving me a son." Xavier's fingers tightened around hers, "for showing me what home really means." Katherine thought of the first time she had seen him, dust-covered and weary, approaching her clothesline with cautious hope in his eyes. How far they had come from that moment through danger and uncertainty, loss and renewal, to this quiet pinnacle of shared joy. "We've built something rare, haven't we?" she mused. Xavier nodded. "Something that will last long after we're gone." As if in agreement, Samuel stirred in his sleep, his tiny hand closing reflexively around Xavier's finger. The gesture, simple as it was, seemed to embody all the connections that bound them together, past to present to future, one life to another in an unbroken chain of love and legacy. Outside their window, the Montana night spread vast and star-strewn above the land they had defended and expanded, the home they had created not just in timber and stone, but in the intangible bonds of family. The new house on the rise stood nearly complete, waiting to receive them. The fields were rich with crops approaching harvest. The cattle grazed peacefully in meadows that stretched toward distant mountains. But the true measure of their success lay here, in this quiet room, a woman who had found the courage to love again, a man who had discovered where he truly belonged, and the children who connected their separate pasts to their shared future. "Sleep now," Xavier murmured, bending to kiss first Samuel's forehead, then Katherine's. "Tomorrow is the first day of forever." As Katherine drifted toward sleep, cradled in the certainty of Xavier's love and the promise of their tomorrow, she knew that whatever challenges life might still hold, they would face them together, the former widow and the wandering cowboy who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. And that, she reflected in her last conscious thought before surrendering to dreams, was the greatest blessing of all.